Right now I'm going through my long list of audio books because I have the time, now or never, right? So this is a very, very good book. If you want to know more about trauma, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors by Janina Fisher. She has given also many lectures. You can find some of them on Wise Mind or on YouTube as well. I find it really helpful to connect with an author and what they write. Then you also can watch a video.
Yes, I've been working with trauma since 1991 in kind of the caveman era of the trauma treatment world, when literally we were inventing the wheel. We didn't know how to treat trauma. Our best guess was that we should use the talking cure, because that's what we knew back in the 90s. But we kept running into the fact that for traumatized individuals, talking about what happened didn't always lead to resolution or relief. It often led to reliving. And I can still remember the days when, if any of us came up with something that worked for our trauma patients, it became a part of what was trauma treatment. So we were just kind of winging it. And it's a very different world now, where there are very clear-cut approaches, often in a bit of competition with each other.
Yeah.
But what has always made sense to me, maybe because of those early years in the trauma field, was to integrate approaches rather than to use an approach with every single patient. I like the idea of bringing models together.
Yeah.
And I've always had a problem with the central idea in trauma treatment, which has been forever and ever. It has been this idea that in order to be free of the past, the patient has to go back into the trauma. And that's disturbed me, I think, just kind of in terms of the fairness. It just never seemed fair that the treatment for unbearable, intolerable experiences should be to relive and feel again unbearable emotions. So I've been exploring all through my career, how do we find gentle, nourishing forms of trauma treatment rather than intense and painful forms of trauma treatment.
The neurobiological legacy of trauma, how we become fragmented. If the elements of the trauma are replayed again and again, the accompanying stress hormones engrave those memories even more deeply into the mind. Ordinary day-to-day events become less and less compelling, not being able to deeply take in what is going on around us makes it impossible to feel fully alive. It becomes harder to feel the joys and aggravations of ordinary life, harder to concentrate on the tasks at hand, Not being fully alive in the present keeps us more firmly imprisoned in the past.
Something that is going to be personalized, is going to be paying attention to the specific situation instead of having one model, but more than anything else, to not re-traumatize clients, that treatment does not mean reliving the horror.
Right. And Rachel Yehuda said something at a conference probably 15 years ago that stopped the audience. You know, you could hear the hush in the room. She was standing in front of probably 600-700 people at Bessel van der Kolk's annual trauma conference. And she looked out at the audience and she said, what does it mean to treat a trauma? Does it mean that we treat the events, or does it mean that we treat the shame, the sense of defectiveness, the hopelessness? And there was this hush when she said, does it mean treating the events? I think the hush was everyone in the room saying, oh my God, we've been treating the events. We haven't, assuming the low self-esteem, the shame, the loneliness, the sense of defectiveness would resolve if we helped people to treat the events. So I'm always looking for approaches that don't treat events. EMDR actually is an approach that doesn't treat the events because it asks the therapist to break the event down into an image, into beliefs, into feelings and body sensation. The somatic therapies, sensorimotor psychotherapy in particular, has also brought a very new approach to trauma treatment. It too treats the body sensations, the emotions, the beliefs, and movement impulses rather than events. And then I've always been a long time fan of internal family systems, and have often integrated sensorimotor psychotherapy and internal family systems. And then I would guess probably 5 years ago, I was thinking one day about this word healing. We talk about trauma healing. And I thought to myself, well, healing is not what people feel when they process traumatic memories. They feel exhausted. They may feel a sense of relief, I got through it, but they don't feel healed. And then I had an epiphany. I thought, no, the moment that we feel healed is the moment that we accept ourselves, we forgive ourselves, we extend compassion to ourselves, and even, God forbid, love ourselves. And then I began to think, okay, how do we help our patients to get there? How do we help them get to that place where they feel a kind of loving attunement with themselves?
In the face of abuse and neglect, especially at the hands of those they love, children need enough psychological distance from what is happening to avoid being overwhelmed and survive psychologically intact. Preserving some modicum of self-esteem, attachment to family, and hope for the future requires victims to disconnect from what has happened, doubt or disremember their experience, and disown the bad victim child to whom it happened as not me. By holding out some sense of themselves as good, disconnected from how they have been exploited, abused children, capitalize on the human brain's innate capacity to split or compartmentalize. Splitting or fragmenting in this way is an ingenious and adaptive survival strategy, but one with a steep price. To ensure that the rejected not me child is kept out of the way, out of consciousness, requires that long after the traumatic events are over, individuals must continue to rely on dissociation, denial, and/or self-hatred for enforcing the disconnection. In the end, they have survived the failure of safety, the abuse, and betrayal, at the cost of disowning their most vulnerable and most wounded selves. Only in the last 10 years have the concepts of implicit memory and bodily-driven responses to trauma become increasingly widespread. But even now, theoretical ideas about splitting parts of the self and dissociation are still controversial and often avoided. We as a field have not yet accepted that compartmentalization is normal under stress and much more common than we generally recognize.
Compassion feels good. So if I have compassion for a baby, a puppy, a bird, any living creature, a plant, if I have compassion for that living creature, it feels warm, it feels moving, and those are good feelings. And so what I wanted was to cultivate those emotional states in traumatized clients. So I set about it by using my two probably preferred modalities in trauma treatment, sensorimotor psychotherapy and internal family systems. Because I wanted the somatic component, because it's not enough to say, I feel for this hurt child inside me. We have to feel that compassion in our bodies. And if we have a traumatized body and a traumatized nervous system, it may be difficult to experience compassion for others. It may be difficult to experience compassion for ourselves. So I wanted the body piece in there. But I don't know if this has been your experience, but my experience over 37 years of practice is that if I say to my patient, it's important that we work on self-compassion, most of my patients would have said, don't ask me to do that. That's disgusting. What a horrible thought.
Yeah.
And not knowing how to do it works for me, because I'm a teacher at heart, and so I'm happy to teach people how to have self-compassion. But my experience has been that self-compassion can more easily be evoked when I ask the patient to have compassion for that little girl or little boy he or she once was. And so I brought in internal family systems, because internal family systems is one of the best clinical models to help people really gain a direct emotional connection to their young selves. So I wanted the body in there, and I wanted a way to help people relate to young, fragmented, wounded selves.
To be an integrated human, as Dan Siegel insists, requires differentiation with linkage. That is, it necessitates the ability to make distinctions between different parts of the self, to name them as parts, but also to link them to other parts and to the whole of which they are a part. Disowning parts of oneself and over-identifying with other parts does not facilitate integration and the sense of being whole, nor does it engender an internal sense of safety that could counteract the after-effects of an unsafe, unwelcoming, hostile world.
Yeah, it's not always smooth sailing, because part and parcel of trauma is a kind of self-rejection and self-alienation that has very powerful, enduring effects. So that my experience has been that my patients have really disowned the trauma in many cases, right? And you've certainly, I'm sure, heard those words. Oh, it wasn't that bad. A lot of people have it much worse. So there is a way that survival requires minimizing, denying, or disowning the trauma. And then when it comes time for the recovery and healing process, we have to own it, except that the habits of survival have resulted in a very profound alienation from what has happened, from the child selves to whom it happened. And often that self-alienation is sort of dug in, is cemented in by habits of self-rejection, self-hatred, self-judgment, etc. Set about creating an integrated model that would allow people to notice. Oh, and the other requirement that this model had to have was that it be mindfulness-based, because all of the most, how can I put it? All of the models that patients endorse. And I think we forget sometimes, we have all this furor over evidence-based treatment now, but we forget at the end of the day, the patient has to like the treatment we're offering. Otherwise, the patient is going to go somewhere else. And we can't push models on patients that patients don't endorse. Patients endorse EMDR. They endorse internal family systems. They endorse sensorimotor psychotherapy. They come back. They enter into the treatment. And these are all mindfulness-based models. I think the mindfulness-based approaches have an inherent gentleness in them that, because it's scary. If you're a trauma survivor, it's scary to be asked to enter into treatments that are very intense without any components that regulate and soothe that intensity. So those are my requirements. It had to be mindfulness-based, it had to have a somatic component, and it had to have a parts component. And it's been lovely to develop this approach and to write about it. And probably the most wonderful feedback I get is directly from patients or from trauma survivors, whether they're patients or not. Every week I get emails from people saying, I read your book and it explained me to myself. I understood why therapists have felt frustrated with me, friends have felt frustrated with me. why I've been so stuck. And I thank you so much for writing it and giving me hope.
One of the difficulties with gaining acceptance for the existence of dissociative splitting, and especially dissociative disorders, has been an absence of studies demonstrating a scientific basis for such dramatic, difficult-to-treat symptoms. Theories of parts tend to be metaphorical rather than biologically or brain-based. In the dissociative disorders world, the explanatory hypothesis has historically been stress-related. When events are traumatic, the theory asserts they exceed the brain's capacity to tolerate or process them as wholes. Therefore, they must be split or compartmentalized, so that overwhelming event memories are shared by dissociated parts of the same age, each carrying some portion of the memory. In this model, each part is viewed as a repository of memory, representing the history of the client at a specific time. In treatment, the parts are encouraged to download or disclose their memories so that the host can share their pain and accept their shared past. Only then could the parts begin fusing into the homogenized whole. To bring credibility to such a controversial not-us topic as dissociation, good clinical models without a theoretical basis are not sufficient. It took the neuroscience revolution to provide a scientific explanation for the concept of splitting, and even to the terminology of parts of the self. It has taken years of research to challenge the fixed negative beliefs about dissociation and dissociative disorders so prevalent in the field. Compartmentalization under stress, exploiting the fault lines. A biological basis for understanding compartmentalization under stress lies in the brain's innate fault lines. The fact that its functions are tied to and governed by different regions and differentiated structures within each region. One fault line for splitting available even at birth is the right hemisphere-left hemisphere split. Though children are born with both left and right hemispheres, they are right brain dominant for most of childhood. The slower developing left brain has spots of growth around the age of language development and again at adolescence. But the development of left brain dominance is only achieved very gradually over the course of the first 18 years of life. In addition, the corpus callosum, the part of the brain that makes possible right brain-left brain communication, also develops slowly and only becomes fully elaborated around the age of 12. Thus, in the early years of childhood, right brain experience is relatively independent of left brain experience, lending itself to splitting should the need arise. Studying brain development in children and adolescents, Martin Teicher has observed a correlation between a history of abuse and/or neglect and underdevelopment of the corpus callosum compared to normal controls. It would also support the hypothesis that trauma is associated with independent development of right and left hemispheres, and that deficits in communication between the two brains may hinder right-left integration, leaving clients with two brains instead of one integrated brain. The split brain research of the 1970s was the first research to show the degree to which left and right hemispheres of the brain operate independently.
I wrote the book with the idea of creating a guide for the therapist, but I also wanted it to be readable for patients, because I believe that so much of the healing process has to be the patient's activity. If you're a trauma survivor and it feels as if your recovery and healing was the work of your therapist, you're still not free. What I want is for people to feel their own capacity for healing.
Yeah.
And for us to be the facilitators of that healing. So when we've lost our sense of agency, as in traumatic experiences, it's important to me that part of the recovery be the recovering of the sense of agency.